Ready.
This is Oral History with Lynn Behrendt on January 10th, 2019. Good afternoon, Lynn.
Good
and welcome.
afternoon. Thank you.
What do you know about your early family history, as far back as you can go?
Oh golly, that's a difficult question. I was just doing some research as Bob was down here. I know about my grandmother's grandparents who were from Niagara Falls, and my grandmother's grandfather was from Hungary and was from a very prominent family in Hungary, and part of his family, Lajos Brooks, was a painter and an artist with quite a following. And it's interesting because that particular strain of genes did pass down through the family, with all the designers, graduates of some prominent design schools in New York, and it's a crazy artistic gene, I believe, that is really transferred through the family. And this particular uncle, Lajos Brooks, has done many illustrations that I've seen in Bibles through the years, and he was really good. In fact, he's got some paintings in Hungary in the museum in Budapest, and some of the family members had been there and had seen his paintings, and it's very interesting because I have an uncle who passed away a few years ago that was a muralist in New York City and did work for Greta Garbo and the French ambassador, and did a beautiful panoramic in the B. Altman's dining room that may still be there. I need to do some research on that. But that gene really came through Loudon.
Was he your mother's brother?
That was my mother's brother, Jean-Pierre Piquet, who used that name, although he was born Phelps Kirsch in Shreveport, Louisiana. But he studied, Granny had some family in Paris, and Piquet was allowed to be sent to Paris when he was 15 or 16 and did study with Erte in Paris. And Erte gave him the idea of changing his name, which he did, as Erte had changed his name, and it became Jean-Pierre Piquet. And anyway, he was a character and a wonderful, wonderful, talented human being, although he really was, Phelps Kirsch was his name. And I think it's so interesting because our son and his wife, Robert and Amanda, have named their baby Phelps after my uncle Piquet and after the family name, which I think is a lovely tribute. And this was all done without Bob and I having any indication that they were going to do this. It was a total surprise and a delight for all of us. But
So tell me about your family life in Shreveport. Did you have a big family?
no, unfortunately not. My parents and my grandparents and family from both sides were born and raised in Shreveport, which was lovely. Mother and Daddy's parents knew one another, and it was quite a congenial group, aunts and uncles and cousins. And I said no as far as the family, but my family was just my sister and myself, and I lost my sister when I was going on 9, She was killed in an automobile accident, which of course devastated my parents. And as I become a parent, I only love and appreciate the fact that they were able to raise me in a fairly normal, very happy environment, so that I wouldn't see their pain, which there was quite a bit of. But as an adult, I look back and I realize that the muffled sobs I heard through the doors were Mother and Daddy grieving all those years for my sister. But basically, I was still able to be a normal teenager and enjoy and having a wonderful type of social and intellectual experience in Louisiana, in Shreveport.
So did this big family with your aunts and uncles, you all get together for
We did.
holidays?
We
and-
did.
Yeah.
I can remember early Passover dinners at my grandmother's house, and that was always something that I look forward to, because my grandparents had been in Shreveport for so many years. It was not necessarily a Jewish Passover. It was a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And Granny would make Delmonico pudding, which was definitely not a Jewish dish, but we loved it because it was colorful and had brandy in it. And I thought that was absolutely the best. It was fun. It was great. And then unfortunately, after my sister's death, Mom and Daddy didn't quite feel up to that type of celebration. So the latter years, we did not have that particular Passover celebration. But on the other side of the family, my daddy's side, we would go to my Aunt Lena's home for fried chicken on Sunday. A very typical Southern experience with all of the family. It was fun, and Aunt Lena was quite a cook, a Jewish German cook, and that's where we learned our matzo balls that are not the typical type of matzo balls most of our friends have, but the hard dumpling matzo balls, which we love, and our daughter-in-law and I have made those together, and that's fun.
Were your parents active at the temple?
They were, Mom and Daddy had a bookstore, or rather, they were very involved in the art and the education, the cultural aspects of the city, extremely involved. Not as much at the temple. Mother was confirmed. She was quite a scholar. And in fact, we have a pin that Mother won for being an excellent student, as well as not missing a day at Sunday school. So I proudly have that hysterical pin, which I love. It's very campy. But that was really the main extent, I think, of their involvement. They were, with their bookstore, anyone who was academic and a reader were their friends. And all of the clergy were close friends. In fact, it was interesting because when Granny, my grandmother, who was born in Shreveport, was educated at the convent, and she was, of course, the only Jewish child at the convent, but that was the best means of education, and that's where Granny went before she was sent off to New York for finishing school. So it was an unusual family. The priest and the sisters at the convent were all close friends of my parents, and everyone was running in and out of the household, but there was always an appreciation for other people and their religions. And that's what I pride mostly in my background, having grown up with this, being from two Jewish parents, but still my feeling that there is so much more out there, and the ability to be able to appreciate each and every one's ideas and their religions, I find very, very comforting. Love that.
Sounds like your family was quite ecumenical.
Very, very ecumenical, extremely so, yes. And in fact, Mother was a Latin scholar, Latin and Greek scholar, and in our home we have some parchment manuscripts that Daddy had found for Mother in New York City years and years ago, that Mother translated all of these manuscripts with a magnifying glass, because the monks didn't do this for the common person to be reading. And I can remember watching Mother for hours with her magnifying glass, and she would say, "Come here, Lynn, come here. This is so interesting. I can actually see into their." The monks would make little notations over the manuscripts, and she said, "I can actually get into their personalities by their notations." I mean, that was just Mama's way of having a little, just a little exercise. She loved that. A crazy family. Very.
Doesn't sound crazy.
No,
Doesn't
just
sound crazy at all.
Most
So
unusual.
you talk about this gene, this design gene, this creative gene. So let's go to your profession. Tell us what you have done professionally.
Well, it can't compare to what my uncle did. I've done interior design for about 50 years, and I've been very fortunate that I have wonderful clients that have become close friends of mine, and I've not promoted myself because that's just not my nature. And if they had seen a home that I had worked on and they wanted to call me, that would be wonderful. And so I won't say I have a humongous business, but it's been enough to make me happy, and Bob supported me, which is very wonderful. And I've had clients that have had incredible art collections, and I love art and have a little bit of a background in art history, and being able to work with their pieces and their things and not to upstage them, to me has been really probably the most exciting element of my business.
Did you have formal training?
Not really. I was a theater and music major, and thought I was going to actually be on Broadway, but things turned a little differently for me, and I do emote when I try to present something to someone as far as what furniture and fabrics they should. So I guess I'm still using a little bit of my training in that regard. But I've studied composition and color and scale, and I've done enough, yes, to get by.
How did you meet Bob?
Well, that's interesting because I'm not sure if you ask him the same question, if we will have the same answers, but that's esoteric. We had a blind date in Shreveport, and Bob was coming through after having attended a wedding in Alexandria, Louisiana, one of his fraternity brothers, and he had met a nurse at this wedding and decided he would follow her back to Shreveport. Well, he got back to Shreveport staying with one of his fraternity brothers, and the nurse turned him down. So I was the second one on the list to be called. His fraternity brother and I were very close buddies, and he said, "Why don't you call Lynn?" So Bob called Lynn, and when he first called, I turned him down because I was madly in love with the cellist who was coming in from LSU, who I thought was going to be my one and only. And I went in the kitchen and said to Mother, a friend of Bobby Redstone's just called, and I told him I was waiting for Millard to come in town. And Mother said, "Oh my gosh, why don't you go out? It'll be so late before Millard comes in town, and you and Bobby and his friend, I'm sure will have a nice evening." So I, being a dutiful daughter like we all were in those days, I called Bob Redstone back and said, "I'll speak to Bob." And I spoke to Bob and said, "Yes, I'd be delighted to go out." So we went out, and that first night, we actually stayed up until about 6 a.m. the next morning, doing nothing but talking in the living room and playing on the hi-fi, Scheherazade, and some wonderful Beethoven. And it was a funny evening when I look back and think about it, but we fell in love. And I actually went into the bedroom where my parents were half asleep and said, "Mother, I'm going to marry this boy." And she said, "Honey, that's fine." She turned over and went back to sleep because that was sort of my typical, the way I operated. Anyway, 14 dates later, I did marry Bob. And it's amazing. We've grown up together, and he's been incredible and has put up with my craziness all these years. And in March, it'll be 58 years, which is amazing.
Did you ever see the cellist again?
As a friend. Millard was so talented, and of course, I was a drama and music major. And we would go into some of these rehearsal rooms, and I can remember Millard playing Moonlight Sonata on the cello, and I would cry. But we were good friends. I mean, when you think about these crazy, how innocent everyone was in those days, it's just amazing, utterly amazing. But yes, we remained friends, and Bob and I did get married. It was a period of 6 months, but we had 14 dates over the 6-month period.
And where did you get married?
We got married in Shreveport in the temple, and it was a beautiful service. Rabbi Lefkowitz, who was a very close friend of my parents, performed the service, and my roommate from LSU, Polly Heinberg, was my only maid of honor, or actually she was the only maid of honor, and then my cousin was matron also in the wedding, who I didn't really care for, but I had to have her, which is true. But anyways, Bob and I were married in March, and Bob had just graduated from Tulane, and he had taken a job with Merrill Lynch in New York in this exciting training program that they had in New York City. So we left Shreveport, flew to New York, had our honeymoon in New York at the Astor Hotel for a week, which is now torn down. And with that, Bob said, "Okay, I'm going to work and you have to get a job." So that next few days, I got a job at Steuben Glass in New York City and ended up in the design department, not designing Steuben Glass, but working with the designers who I loved and who taught me so very much about scale and design, and they were just wonderful group to work with. So that's where we were in New York City, and Bob was with Merrill in this training program, and we lived in Brooklyn Heights, which was really fairly colorful. It wasn't the Brooklyn Heights that it is today. We lived above a pizza parlor that was always catching fire, and the fumes from the pizzas, I'm surprised I can still eat pizzas, but I can. But it was an interesting experience, to say the least. I used to shop at Bohack's, which was a grocery store down the street, and Truman Capote was there, and I would bump into True at the, at Bohack's. Hey, True, how are you? What are you up to? And he knew this little girl from the South, and we were buddies. We were a good buddy. It was fun.
So he knew your parents?
No,
Oh.
no, Truman did not, but it's interesting. I have since read that his father was born in Shreveport, which I did not know at the time, except I knew that we gravitated to one another because he liked my Southern accent. And, a friendly face in New York City, I guess it's hard to find. But we were grocery buddies, and that was fun.
So how long were you in New York?
2 years, and we loved it. And we were, of course, starving, and Mother and Daddy would send us money so we could go to the theater, and that was one of those wonderful experiences. And we would take the subway and go and see whatever we could find that we could afford. We would sometimes do standing room only, but we were still at the theater. And that's what, of course, I have always loved. And I think I passed that particular love down to one of our grandsons, who has written a book, and I'll plug the book because it's coming out next November, and it's about the Broadway musical divas of the past, and it's written in verse. And it's going to be, it is illustrated with a very talented illustrator from DreamWorks in California, and Random House snapped up the book. And John was getting his MBA at the time he wrote this book, and we are all so excited. We don't know it's really going to be fun, and there's a possibility that he may do a series of books very similar to this. The next one will be film. He's quite a character, and a wonderful, wonderful grandson that calls to tell me what he's doing and what he's seen, and he lives in New York with his family. His daddy is at Trinity, a headmaster at Trinity, and our daughter is a very talented interior designer who lives in New York City. And that gene definitely came down, because Michelle she's also she can illustrate, she scales, she's renderings. I mean, it's amazing to see the talent that your own child has. And then for her child to inherit this also, he went to Northwestern, and the same talent, the same gene has really passed on to this kid. He's the eldest of her 3 children, and of course, I adore each and every one of them, and they're all so different. I mean, it's really a most unusual family, to say the least.
What legacy do you believe your parents left for you for living life?
I think the feeling that everybody has something very special and very good in their personality, in their makeup, and to be able to look for that in different people, I really feel is what I've inherited from my parents. Daddy was, I was just reading in some of the different papers from Shreveport. When Daddy died, there were editorials about my daddy, who was a very simple man, owned a bookstore, but everybody loved him because his ability to be at the same table with the president of the bank, and I mean table, not literally, but to have a conversation with the shoe shine boy, and that was my father. He was the salt of the earth type of a very bright man, but also he had this incredible ability to love humanity, as my mother did in a very different way. Mother was a real Greek and Latin scholar. Mother was brilliant. And after sister died, Mother, to pull herself together, went back to college. She had gone only 2 years before she and Daddy were married, and Mother went back to centenary and ended up graduating Phi Beta Kappa in her 40s. But that was a side of Mother that had everyone gravitate to her. We used to have all the kids from centenary in the house as their friends, and the fact that these were friends that were 20 years, 30 years younger, and also the professors that were friends of theirs, has made me appreciate my background and my parents, and the fact that they were in the book business, and all of these interesting people that would spend time in our home as friends just made you realize what an interesting, fun world it is. I remember in those days before we had people coming in and out on airplanes, Richard Llewellyn, who's an author, came down, and he was quite an alcoholic, and stayed in the house for about 5 days, drunk as a skunk, sleeping on the couch in the living room, and we all had fun. And I, as a child, it was never anything that I wasn't threatened. My parents explained, well, he likes to drink, and my parents enjoyed a drink or two also. It was just a different atmosphere, a very intellectual, bohemian atmosphere, but one with such love and compassion for each and every person that that's what I feel they gave me.
And what legacy would you like to leave for your children?
Lord, that's a tough one too. I think probably the same feeling that to know that there are people that even though they may come across with a different attitude and an outlook, but you still have to look for the good in that person and try to have a little more compassion and love for them and not be so rigid. I think that being a little looser in life helps a lot too. And I think that now we have 4 grandsons, and of course we're still looking at what 3.5-year-old is going to end up doing besides working on trucks and things of that type. But I'm sure, hopefully he'll be a good kid, because our son is such a wonderful, compassionate, intellectual, and his wife also. I think they'll be okay. I think he'll be okay. I see the handwriting now for the other 3 boys, which I think they're most unusual family. Daddy being a headmaster and an educator, and Michelle being an interior designer, and the big son who has written this book is with home HBO, and it has just gone with them, gotten his master's, and is gonna. He'll be doing something that we'll all hear about, I'm sure. And grandson number 2, who we adore, is an outdoorsman and a free spirit. And when people ask, where does he live? Well, he and his girlfriend live in his car. So that's a rather unusual thing to say too, but he works for Knowles, and he takes kids and young adults out for 3 and 4 weeks at a time in Utah and Wyoming, and this kid has got a heart that you would not believe anyone this young, he's 25, could have the love and compassion that he has for everyone and everything. When Michelle and John left Houston, Brooks was a junior in high school, which was a pretty difficult time for a kid to be taken out of school. And they moved to New York City, and within a number of months, Brooks was well accepted. He ended up being the captain of their lacrosse team, and he has got friends like my parents had, from A to Z, from whatever color, persuasion. Every time we go to New York, and if Brooks is up there, it's a ball, because these kids drift in and out. Sometimes they sleep in the house, and you step over bodies going down the hall. It's amazing. And I'm so proud of our kids, of our daughter and son-in-law, who have this kind of home that all of their friends are comfortable and stroked and loved for what they are. And
Well, you've definitely left them a wonderful legacy.
well,
in that
I
regard.
hope so. I hope and pray. But we're proud of all the children and their spouses. Their spouses may not be what, it's not a typical Jewish household, shall I say. Our son-in-law is Episcopalian. Our daughter-in-law is Baptist. And yet, honey, they have Jewish hearts. That's all. I keep telling them that you do have a Jewish heart. So we feel very blessed, very blessed.
Thank you so much, Lynn. This has been great. We appreciate your time.
Well, honey, I appreciate you, and thank y'all for doing this, because I really didn't know what,